Nice.
Mm.
All right, so you were talking about what you felt was your happiest and I guess the most exciting time for you during your tenure at Disney. Talk about some of the shows and the process of helping to reinvent ABC's Saturday morning lineup.
Well, you know, when I took over animation, it was a dying division of the company. TV animation, it was a dying division of the company, and but there were hundreds of talented people working there. There were these animators who would all be locked behind their doors and be listening to music, and by this point I'd become a fairly heavy art collector, so I was already interested in visual culture, and I'd always loved animation. Anyway, I mean, it was a huge. I wrote. One of my college theses was on Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, which is why you see that up there, which I think was, to this day, I think is one of the greatest works of American art made in the last century, and right up there with the greatest jazz or the greatest the greatest movies. And so I've always loved animation. I've always loved its potential to express things and everything else. And particularly times since I was interested in art, it got even more interesting for me. And you know, these kids would come in there and they'd get excited about something. They'd pitch you something and they start drawing on your wall, you know. And it just didn't happen in the network TV business. You know, it was all very corporate, and you know, it was all like a lot of depressed Jews and you know, people who've been beaten up by the network system for a long time. The animators weren't really beaten up. They were kind of countercultural and a little weird and kind of geeky, and I really loved working with them. And
probably also a lot of really fresh voices, which is always
They were fresh voices. They had their own ideas, and they were genuinely funny. And you know, they were an anarchic lot. And you know, this was still a studio that needed to produce things, but there was no place to put these things that we produced anymore. What were we going to do with them? We owned no network. When ABC came around, and we had Saturday morning, now we had a network. And Michael loved Saturday morning just as much as I did, if not more, because he had spent time as an executive in Saturday morning in his ABC days. And so by that point, I'd already, you know, there was a huge revival going on within the division. I'd taken some money and I had given some money to just seeded projects that had no place to go ultimately, but we decided to make them anyway. So we decided to make basically a fractured fairy tales. We'd find the funniest producers and the funniest writers we could find and have them do something. We did one with the Three Little Pigs that Dan O'Shannon, who was a writer on Cheers, had pitched me, and we animated it, and we had nowhere to put it. We just did it. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, and you know, I'm sure if Michael had known, he wouldn't have appreciated it. But once I did it, I just, you know, they couldn't catch up with me. I was just and we were doing a lot of that. And it was reviving the division, because all of a sudden people felt like their stuff could get made. And that's really why I did it, was I felt that, you know, you could sit there with thousands of, or hundreds of talented animators, and they were just sitting there at their desks, you know, drawing little doodles, because their work wasn't going anywhere and they couldn't get anything made. And I thought, well, you know, if we don't have any place to make it, let's just make it. It's worth a few $100,000 to do that. And so we did it. And it did wonders for the morale in the division, and then we at the same time the division had released Gary, my predecessor, had taken 4 episodes of Aladdin, the TV show Aladdin, which was running in syndication, and he glued them together, and they sold it as a direct video release, as a sequel to the movie Aladdin, and it did phenomenally well. And I thought, well, that's actually a great business. Why can't we do tons of stuff like that, direct to video? And so I approved, you know, a whole like 10 or 15 scripts going into development, one of which is a sequel to Aladdin, another one was Lion King, and all these Pocahontas, basically every movie that Disney had ever made, Lady and the Tramp, you name it, we were in development on the direct-to-video sequel.
This is like very canny business stuff, because what you're talking about is using Disney Home Video, using the resources of the animators that are living there, the resources of titles and characters in the vast Disney library. Sort of, how was this regarded through the company?
Well, Michael obviously, I don't know how it was regarded through the company. I mean, I think the feature. Well, I can tell you, the feature animated guys didn't like it. They didn't have control over it, and it was in their minds it was their IP that somebody else was screwing with and making the money on. So they didn't like that. And my feeling was, well, fine, you make it. I don't really care. But but I would just decide to ignore them for the most part because it just wasn't a productive way to spend time. And Michael loved the idea of it, and he would keep sending me notes. You really should clear this with the feature guys, but I knew he didn't really mean it, and there was no way to do it that way. So I would just ignore the notes, and I'd ignore them, and I just kept spending money, and we kept doing it, and they were getting better and better, and it was incredibly great. The business was enormous fun because it involved music. So you could go and guys who write music, there's not that much calling for them. So you can get the best people in the world to write you a song for not very much money for the most part. And so it was fantastic. People come in and, it's like the old days in Tim Panal, somebody would play you, I need a song right here where the guy, first meets the girl. And, and they'd sit there and they go, what about this? And you kind of go, I don't like that. I like this a little more like that. And it was fantastic. It was loads of fun. And just the variety of the different kinds of skills that went into making a animated production was fantastic. I really enjoyed that part of it. And at the same time, so that started firing, and the releases that we did incredibly well. There was a great demand for that product in the marketplace. And then the ABC thing, we just started. We started trying to just get the best, as usual, just trying to get the best writers for that kind of content, and who's really making great animated stuff. And some of them were at Nickelodeon. Jim Jenkins, the guy who was making Doug, was a show that we really liked and we thought was very Disney compatible. So we decided to go after him. And as we went after him, we realized that he had a really bad relationship with Nickelodeon and that Doug was coming up. And so we decided to just try to get Doug, and which Nickelodeon was, because their rights were lapsing and they weren't happy. And but we got Doug, and that could be a sort of a building block to Saturday Morning because it had a very substantial audience. And Jim was a very gifted guy. And we went after a bunch of other people. Peter Hastings, who did Pinky and the Brain, which was a show I really liked a lot. It's just a really brilliant show. And we brought him over and were able to make a deal with him. And then we started thinking about how the Saturday Morning, how we could do it differently. We started thinking about it as a whole module as opposed to just show after show. We started thinking about it as a continuous block with hosts and with interstitial programming, and it was all sort of unified into one experience. And that's really what we did. And we ultimately came up with the idea of one Saturday morning, that there was this address called One Saturday Morning, and there were various apartments and buildings within it, and those were the shows. And
hey, that's what you're talking about is a programming conceit as much as anything.
Right. Well, we had a different. We started doing things that were I think was pretty different than what people were expecting, so the shows we did for that were, and that did really, when that debuted really just as I was leaving the company at that point, but it did incredibly well for at least like a couple of years. Then they started tinkering with it, and they didn't refresh the shows, and they didn't spend we spent a lot of money to get good writers. Obviously that sort of stopped at some point, and but it was great fun. It was complicated politically too, because they had hired Jerry Laybourne from Nickelodeon at that point to be in charge of it, and so that created all sorts of issues about who was really running Saturday Morning, with the guy who was producing the shows, but it became moot because by the time it really became an issue, I was leaving the company.
I want to back up for a second. There's a question I'd asked you earlier, and then something that you had sort of said with regard to home improvement, just in terms of family programming. Obviously now your focus with all the Saturday Morning stuff is children's programming, and I also want to touch on TGIF before we leave Disney and ABC, but talk about, you must have, and like I said, I think you sort of touched on it talking about home improvement, developed a kind of a view or vision or a philosophy about family or children's programming. Talk a bit about that, about what you sort of set out to do when developing for that audience.
Well, television for me was always about family. It went back to my own memories of growing up and, sitting in bed with my mom and dad watching Mighty Mouse. It was always built into that. That's when I think of television, I think of family. They're not separate things to me. I never really enjoyed, the late night, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock shows and all that stuff. So, and working families was always what it was about. And increasingly over my time in TV, that vision was not a vision that it was a vision that was not shared by the people. And increasingly, as time went on, I was a minority view about that, and that really reflects part of where the economy was evolving and where the money was going from the advertising standpoint. People didn't want to talk to lower middle class viewers. They were not what advertisers wanted. They wanted upscale 23-year-old New Yorkers, because that's where the money was and that's where the money was going. I thought it was short-sighted over time, but maybe it wasn't, because that's really, they did really, really well for a long, NBC and ABC did really well for a long time. But I'd always believed in that, and I've always been most comfortable with family programming, and where there's a mom and a dad and kids, and the issues are issues of how the family works together, and particularly with comedies. So that's what I like. It's what I enjoy. It's what I respond to. It's what I like making, and it's what I like thinking about. That was becoming increasingly difficult. And it was becoming increasingly difficult at ABC, which is where we had our relationships, which is why I stopped really becoming involved in it. But my vision about television was always that, was sort of producing 8 o'clock shows about real family issues, what I responded to. It was really in a way, I guess, to sort of reflect the world that I grew up in. The world that I grew up in, Queens, wasn't on TV anymore. It was all Manhattan, from 72nd up to 89th. That was the world of television. But the world I grew up in, Queens and Sunnyside and Jackson Heights, that wasn't on TV anymore. And that bugged me. And I wanted to see that back, and to put on programming that spoke to that group of people, which I think was the largest part of America, and by far the most valuable part of America. That wasn't to be. And it was a long battle that went on for years, and even at UPN, and that I lost, frankly, and probably inevitably. But that was my main interest. And it's not that I don't like 9 o'clock shows. I love Cheers. Cheers is one of my favorite shows of all time. But as a programmer, and as what I really enjoyed making, what I think the networks really needed to stay alive and to stay relevant, and to not allow the cable business to destroy them, I thought they needed to make that kind of programming. And I think their failure to do that really made the encroachment of the cable business that much more inevitable and that much quicker.
Then, speaking to that, talk about your relationship with the network as it related to TGIF and making shows like Boy Meets World, and how ultimately that franchise disappeared.
Well, Boy Meets World came out of exactly that. I mean, Stu Bloomberg really liked family programming as much as I did, and sort of responded to it in the same way. And Boy Meets World really came out of just a vision that I had one day when I was just driving in, of like this little obnoxious kid going, da-da, and I kept thinking about that kid and who he might be, and I thought, well, what if there's a Ferris Bueller, but he's 9 or 11, as opposed to 18? Who's that kid? And as much as I hate smart-ass kids, I thought it might make really great comedy. And I pitched it to Michael and to Jacobs, and he liked it too, and we started working on it. And we thought that every kid in America could relate to that, or at least would want to be that or be part of that. And he did a really great show around it, I think, and really kind of the best thing he's done. But the opportunities for that over the years, that was 92 or something. But by 94, 95, it was impossible. ABC didn't want to have anything to do with Friday night anymore, basically. The Miller Boyette, they didn't want that kind of programming. They looked down on it. If you spent time talking to Ted Harbert and to Iger, to them that was like rock gut. It it was equivalent to Four Roses whiskey. You know what I mean? It's just like it's what educated people don't drink. And they didn't want to make it anymore. They thought the time period was, advertisers didn't want to pay money for it, didn't want to pay top dollar for it, and they thought the time periods could be better spent with other kinds of programming. So they had already kind of made the decision to not support it over time. And even though there were shows that came in and they did it, their heart wasn't in it, and they didn't put up the resources or the man hours or the passion to get it done. And it just kind of it frittered away in the same attempt to chase the highest end of the CPM spectrum.
But the interesting thing is, it seems like the numbers kind of told a different story. At least when you're talking about households, that's
the problem.
That was a strong franchise to the end until they abandoned it. So much so that I guess CBS picked up Family Matters when ABC said they didn't want it anymore.
But the advertisers weren't buying households anymore; they were buying demos, and so they were buying oxygenated demos that made a lot more money. They didn't care about households, and as the sales department got away from, it was a sales department at ABC that ran ABC. That was the truth of it, and as the more and more that happened, the less commitment they had to that kind of programming. So they just didn't want to have anything to do with it. It embarrassed them. 8 o'clock shows in general. Whether Roseanne or TGIF, embarrassed them politically. It embarrassed them culturally. They didn't view themselves as part of that group. They personally wanted to get away from being perceived as those kind of people. For the same reason that CBS in the 70s got away from all its cracker comedies. From it was too embarrassing for the executives of CBS to go to parties and be known as the guys who were putting on Beverly Hillbillies and Petticoat Junction, and
even though those were the highest rated shows of the time. Absolutely,
and they just didn't want to be perceived. So that happens. I think we can argue about that, but that's really what happened, and that's what happened at ABC. And the network has never really recovered. I mean, it's been a weak network ever since it destroyed its 8 o'clock. The strength of ABC was always their 8 o'clock shows. And their family shows, and once they destroyed that, the network never recovered, and it was a strategically stupid mistake. It could have extended their life and their profits significantly. So it's bad business, but you can certainly understand why they did it.
So now talk about your exodus from Disney.
It was time to go. I said I stopped enjoying my network time. I didn't really want to do it anymore. The way it was set up, there was clear that there had to be some resolution between who controlled the network or the studio who controlled it. And if I wasn't going to be the guy controlling it, I didn't really want to be. I didn't want to take orders from the head of ABC. And I didn't get along well enough with Bob Iger to think that I was going to wind up running ABC. And it's not clear to me that I would have wanted to do that anyway, because the challenges by that point, as I looked down the road at what ABC was going to face and its lack of programming and its really weak management, it struck me that it was not going to be a happy experience. So the more I kept thinking about it, the more I kept thinking there's no happy way for me to be here. And in animation, that was becoming problematic too, because ABC wanted more say in their Saturday morning thing. And
you said Jerry Laybourne was there kind of dictating that.
Yeah, and I didn't really want to get involved in another 2 years worth of corporate battle, even though, that one I think we would have inevitably won, just because Disney was a much stronger brand name and much more meaningful, and she really wasn't she's not an executive who particularly understood what a lot of these issues were about ultimately. Though she's a very gifted executive in a lot of ways, but just not in that particular situation. And so that's really what it was time to go. And then it just became, once I decided that it was time to go, it really became a question. And at the same time, Michael, the Disney that I had loved, and that was the sort of the Buccaneer Disney and the iconoclastic Disney and the Disney of like lots of different people arguing, and had really, really changed. Frank Wells had passed on. Jeffrey Katzenberg, Michael had fired Jeffrey. It was just Michael now, and Michael has tremendous talents and tremendous debits, and he has a lot of as he began believing his own press about his talents, he became more and more difficult to deal with, and more resistant to hearing news that he didn't want to hear, and sort of the classic emperor story, and Disney became, as a result, just a much less nice place to work, not just for me, but for a lot of people, so it was clear that there was really no place. It was no place I wanted to be, and at the same time, UPN reached out through a mutual friend. I can't remember exactly how it came up, but maybe it was Evan Thompson through Randy Reese, who had already left Disney at that point. But had reached out to me and asked me if I'd be interested in coming to talk to them to run UPN. And I have to say my initial thinking about that was no, but if I could have found a way to stay at Disney in a way that pleased me, just doing animation, I probably would have done that just because I enjoyed the process so much. But I didn't think that there was, and not only that, but I thought that there were things that were happening in the animated world that was going to change animation. A lot of it having to do with CGI and the new technologies, and we just were so far behind in the TV division in that part because there had really not been sufficient investment. And when I looked at Pixar and I went to see John Lasseter there, and you see how advanced they were, and how it really felt like we were some sort of 19th century writing with a quill pen, and so the challenges just seemed so great, so it was just time. It was time to, but there was no way to stay there. It was really time to move on, and so I of all the things that were short of just retiring, which I guess I could have done, but I was 42 years old, and I really felt that I wanted to try something else, and so I decided that I would take a shot at UPN, and because it was the best of all the things that were, and it was the most engaging and the chance to do the most interesting stuff.
So now talk about what UPN was at that moment in time as you walked into the building.
UPN was it's United Paramount Network, and it was called United Paramount Network because it was owned by United television stations, which were owned by Chris Kraft. It was owned 50% by United and 50% by Paramount, Viacom, Paramount, and Paramount wanted to have a television network because they wanted to have distribution for their shows in a world where increasingly everybody was both a studio and a network. And the United television stations, Chris Kraft wanted to have content because the large studios were increasingly just funneling their content through their own distribution systems. So it seemed like a merger that was important for both parties to make, and they were 50-50 partners in setting up this network. So the first thing that UPN was a 50-50 partnership between a studio, a production company, and a station group to do that. And then UPN as a network was a 3-night-a-week network, one night of which was Monday night, which was a night of all black comedies, Tuesday night, which was a night of 3 black comedies and 1 white comedy, if I can use that expression. Though there are obviously very interesting sociological things happening from within that. And there was one night of, I can't remember what the third night was.
Wasn't the sci-fi where they still had to...
And they had Star Trek, and they had Star Trek and something else, and I don't remember what the other show was. But that was really what UPN was at that time. And the rest of the nights were back to the station. It was significantly behind in its projections, though I didn't realize quite how much until I got there in terms of where their financial...
Projections in terms of ad sales, or expanding the network in terms of hours?
Ad sales. In terms of where their revenue was, given where they thought it was going to be. And a lot of stuff came to light in the time after I took the job. But so that's really what it was. And so the challenge was how to make that. And it was competing with the WB, which was a similar network formed out of the same sort of partnership between Tribune and Warner Brothers. The WB had not done that much better, but it started really succeeding a little bit recently, and UPN really hadn't. And it was an enormous challenge because there was how do you make a network work in this environment? What kind of shows do you put on? It's really starting from scratch, and that is an exciting thing. But as it turned out, it really wasn't starting from scratch, because what Lucy Salhaney, my predecessor, had done was, by programming black shows, she had created a pattern that was very, 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 very difficult to break for the network. And so its entire viewership and the stations that did the best were stations that were very, very heavily African American. And that became a problem for how to create a network that had broad appeal, because the African American community and the non-African American community watch different shows, have totally different viewing habits. So if you look, even to this day, it's changing. It started to change with this next generation of African American kids. But in 90 and 97, if you look at what blacks watch and what whites watch, they're two totally different shows, two totally different things in the top 10. And the only time that they sort of converged with them was something like Cosby, which had both. But for the most part, what a black viewer watched and what a white viewer watched, you could see 10 shows that would have nothing to do with each other. So if you have a night that has only African American viewership, how do you promote new shows that are maybe mixed? You know, that it's a mixed comedy with people who are white, African American, Chinese. Very difficult, because the only people watching it are African American. So what that means is that the next show you're going to produce is probably geared toward an African American audience. That becomes a problem, both in terms of the narrowness of the base, because the African American community is only 12% of the United States. So you're already limiting. But it's also a problem from the advertiser standpoint, because it tends to be poorer, more rural, and so now you're getting into problem selling stuff. So it's clear that the challenge we faced was how to broaden, how to deal with what was there, because we weren't starting from scratch. If we were starting from scratch, it would have been a very, very different thing. But we already had a footprint, and the stations that were part of the group were in large urban areas that had large African American populations, or in rural areas that had large didn't want any change at all, because they were doing much better numbers than they'd been doing otherwise. So we really entered a very, very difficult programming situation of how to put a network together that could
to break the cycle that had already been established.
To break a cycle that had been established, and frankly, it's a very cynical to program simply to an African American audience on network TV. My point of view about it was that it was a profoundly cynical thing to do, because as incredibly important as it was for there to be more shows for African American viewers, because there'd always been not enough, and particularly behind the camera and writing, it's a much easier audience to roust up than it is to roust up a broader audience, because African American viewership is very highly concentrated. So there will be a significant percentage of the African American community that watches a show that's specifically geared to them. Very, very difficult. So it's much easier to sort of get a baseline going with a show targeting an African American audience than a show targeting something else. And that was a major, major problem. But it was easy to program that, because all of a sudden you got a 6 or 7 share. It was like, wow, that's great. The problem was it never got to be more than a 6 or 7 share ever. So you could never grow, and the next show would be a 5 share. So it was a very cynical programming strategy. It was very, and I felt it was fundamentally in my gut, I felt that it was exploitive as well of the African American community. And so I had I had really lots of issues with it. And I also felt that the shows were kind of minstrel shows for the most part. A lot of which is ironic in light of some of the stuff that happened in the history of UPN. But that was sort of my feeling going in, is that we needed to undo something that I felt was both unethical and a bad programming strategy, and to try to find something else to become a keystone of the network. So
what were some of the first steps you took to kind of put the network on a better path?
Well, we started a couple of things. One is we canceled a couple of what I thought were the more egregious shows that bugged me particularly, like LL Cool J's show, which I can't remember.
In the House? In
the House, and some of those where I really felt were kind of bordering on minstrelsy, and then the other thing, we started putting shows into development that I thought would signal a new direction. I was really particularly interested in, as I'd said before, in finding a way of doing shows from Middle America, kind of creating what I thought was a hole in the marketplace. That if ABC and NBC and these guys were going to abandon programming for Middle America, well, we'd be the guys doing that. We'd be making the Roseannes and the Home Improvements and and that's really what we started putting into development. So those were the two main things we started to do. Then we started to also expand the nights so that we wouldn't be so bound by by a night and a half of programming. And so we added 2 nights of program, which of course put huge strains on the budget because all of a sudden there was not much more programming that had to be.
Was the budget not expanded to accommodate those plans?
It was, and it was probably, in retrospect, I would have to say that I think it was it was probably too aggressive an agenda too early. That we probably needed to consolidate some of the changes before we went trying to expand the nights of programming. That just put too much stress on the budget. They coughed up more money to the board coughed up more money to make to make those programs, but they'd already lost so much in the previous 3 to 4 years of the network's existence that it was painful. And so it really meant that if those shows didn't work right off the bat, there was going to be an enormous amount of screaming and agonized screaming, which in fact turned out to be the case.
How much did you feel like you were competing directly head-to-head with the WB as opposed to just fighting for a place on the larger network landscape?
Yeah, we felt that it was completely the WB. We were placed in that category by advertisers, by the press, by each other. The WB was very aggressive in competing against UPN, especially. All sorts of they would say all sorts of negative things publicly and privately, and so it was very much a competition between the two. It had built up in Lucy's time. I inherited it. I tried to get away from it because I knew Jamie pretty well and I liked him, but it was not to be. It was very, very competitive, and it was. They really felt that any ad dollar that went to us was an ad dollar out of their mouths, and so they were committed to destroying UPN as much as they could.
And how did you combat that?
Just the normal ways, the press and everything else, but it was difficult, and it was difficult particularly because they had begun having success with a young female audience with Dawson's Creek, which really kind of lit them up, and with advertisers and with the press. So we just looked like the ugly sibling after that.
So do you try and go after their audience or counter program them?
No, it was clear going after their audience was not didn't seem particularly viable. But we decided to counter program and to sort of become a young male network. This is already a couple of years in, but that was our response to do that. Honestly, I didn't believe in either of them, and neither of them were real strategies. Neither of them really can sustain a network over the long haul. But for the point of view of the press, it was an easy, and advertisers, which they're not the two swiftest institutions in our country, advertisers and press, and they need simple things to understand, and from having to give them simple things, that worked. We're a network for young guys, and they're a network for young women. So that sort
simple differentiation.
Simple differentiation, yeah. And but anyway, it was.
You had some franchises to sort of back that up. Let's talk a bit about Star Trek, which obviously Paramount as a company felt like that's sort of the flagship that led the network out to sea. Talk about, I think it started with, what was the first UPN Star Trek show? Was Voyager, I believe?
Star Trek, yeah.
And then during your time, Enterprise was developed and put on the air.
That's right. So that Voyager, the end of Voyager, and the beginning of Enterprise. So
talk about that during your tenure.
Well, Star Trek was it was a very loaded situation because apart from any of the creative issues, Paramount. It was a very important franchise for Paramount. They made an enormous amount of money on it, foreign, everywhere else you can imagine. And Chris Kraft, the other 50% ownership, really felt that Paramount was getting all these benefits from financial benefits from Star Trek that they weren't getting from the network, which all the network was doing was writing a check for each episode and then having to sell it maybe at a break-even level if it was lucky. So it really, Star Trek particularly, led to what was a horrible, horrible dysfunctional relationship between the partners that ignited almost immediately. They hated each other, and both personally and professionally. And so by the time I got there, they were no longer on speaking terms. I didn't know that, but they no longer spoke. And Star Trek was the key to the lack of trust between them. And so it was always it always had a affect around it. It always had emotions around it that went well beyond whatever it was doing in the ratings or whatever the creative issues with it were or anything else. And Paramount also closely guarded control of it because it was their franchise, and so it was very difficult to have any kind of input into the evolution of the show. And so it was very problematic in lots of ways. I mean, advertisers liked it, but it didn't drive anything else. Paramount never developed a successful 1 hour companion piece to it, so it was difficult. It was just sitting there. And in fact, every piece that Paramount tried to develop was disastrous. At one, not just bad, but horrible.
Can you remember any of those?
I remember every one of them, but they were they were just really, really cheesy. They were cheesy, third-rate, hacky action shows, except for one, which was Special Unit, whatever the last one we did, which was Special Unit something, which was actually pretty good, not great, but it was a big improvement. But for 3 or 4 years, it just delivered one bad thing after another, and so we weren't able to get any real benefit out of it, and so there was incredible resentment on the guys at Chris-Craft toward Paramount, which was making tons of money out of this thing, hundreds of millions of dollars, while the network was bleeding hundreds of millions of dollars.
So did you regard it as sort of an albatross then for you?
I didn't regard it as an albatross, but I regarded it as it was nice to have anything that sort of kept the time period, but and that did some number and that we had to sell. But I regarded it as really frustrating that we couldn't make more out of it, and that as a studio, Paramount, was just so weak at development that it could never capitalize on it. And in the Enterprise, in the last Star Trek, I had problems with it creatively, and I felt that it was old and tired, and I felt like I'd seen it all before, and I felt that the audience, which is already sort of losing its Trekkies were already losing their enthusiasm for the franchise, was not going to come back, and because you can't keep just treating them like a marketing machine, and I had endless talks with Carrie McCluggage, who was the head of Paramount, and they just felt that they wanted to do what they wanted to do, and we didn't really have any. Ultimately, we had no say over it, and that's really what happened. And they did the show, and it was bad. And what we wanted to do was something much more akin to sort of Star Trek Academy, where young, good-looking kids in spaceships shooting each other and having sex. They wanted to do some 45-year-old guy prowling about in some spaceship, and it was just really with a lot of guys in funny ears, was just really kind of very, very tired. And it turned out to be that. So it was, but it was the UPN experience was it was a great experience in terms of learning many things about running a business, because I'd never had the opportunity to do that. It's one thing to be a creative guy at a studio. It's another thing to really be responsible for all the aspects of an entire company, the sales, the marketing, and everything else. That was incredible, and it was a real thrill to be involved in all those things. It was probably one of the most complicated jobs that anybody's ever undertaken in the entertainment industry, just because the nature of the structure of the ownership and the evolution of the business at that point made managing it, and the lack of resources that the network had, made managing it almost impossible. By far the most difficult thing I'd ever had to do in my life.
Do you feel that just in the DNA of the construct between Paramount and Chris-Craft, that its fate was kind of inevitable?
Yes. its fate was inevitable. I mean, first of all, the Paramount guys really did look at the Chris-Craft guys as a bunch of rubes who came in from, out in the country, and they were perfectly willing to slice off better pieces of the beast for themselves. So Paramount did benefit incredibly, and they had lots of different agendas, and they really, basically took the Chris-Craft guys for a ride. And the Chris-Craft guys were not very swift and had no management, no infrastructure, no way of understanding anything. It was just a couple of guys, basically, and they had no ability to deal with what they were dealing with, and they had no particular financial skills, no particular creative skills. And all they had was a lot of sullenness at getting hosed, which they knew, but they just couldn't figure out how they were getting hosed. So it was a very, very ugly situation. And anytime you have a 50-50 relationship like that, where that's not a good thing. And that wasn't a good thing because they each had control over the budget, 100%. So they could paralyze the network, and that is in fact what they did on a continuing basis. When they stopped speaking to each other, they would stop approving the budget. So you would no longer have the ability to produce shows, or to order episodes, or to order mid-season episodes without going to each of them. And it was just they created a situation where the network couldn't possibly succeed. Now, chances are that given the plate tectonic shift in the industry, there's no way that it would have succeeded anyways. We can see from the CW now, which is continuing to fail, probably at a more aggressive rate than UPN ever did, but it's just for whatever reason, it's being kept alive. The moment will come where it's shut down. The business doesn't need it anymore. It didn't need that then. It doesn't need it now. We kind of those networks outlived the network moment, and they were
just in terms of the need of another broadcast network.
Right. The world had changed to a cable world and a niche world, and the broadcast world was over. The station business continued to be a good business for a few more years, but it was clear even then that the station business at some point would start eroding under the weight of all these cable and internet wasn't on them. But if you looked out far enough, you could see that there were going to be issues with it.
But here we are, a few weeks from the changeover to digital. And the CW is still there.
It's still there, but it's losing $50 million a year. It's being kept there probably out of, out of ego needs, because you don't want to shut it down. It looks bad to shut down a network, but it will be. Trust me, it'll be shut down. It's never made money. It's always lost somewhere between $25 million and $125 million a year. That's not something that a company like CBS, that whose share price is now down like 75 or 80% can afford to keep doing, and it won't. So yeah, I mean that's gonna go away. But as I said, that's sort of inevitable. The network business itself will go away because, or at least will change so radically that it won't look anything like what it looks like now.
A couple other sort of moments in your history at UPN. Talk about acquiring Buffy.
Well, my God, we never had any resources, so it was impossible to really have money to produce shows. They weren't willing to spend it, and I know that sounds odd because you spent all this money on Buffy, but but from the very beginning of my time at UPN, there was no money. And we wanted to buy, this is documented elsewhere, but we wanted to buy Survivor in the summer of '97 because Mark Burnett and Conrad Riggs, who used to work for me, were rattling around trying to sell this thing. And it wasn't that it was any great programming. We just needed something in the summer to put on that wasn't just repeats of Star Trek, which did no business. So we said, well, let's buy Survivor. That could be interesting. What the hell, And we wanted to buy it, but we needed to pay them for 13 episodes to shoot 13 episodes through. You can't shoot 6. And we couldn't get approval from the two partners for the additional 7 episodes to pay for it. So we had to decline. And, they went to CBS. I mean, it was just painful. When it became such a huge hit, it was particularly painful. So we never had any resources. And Buffy, and so the strategy that I went to a year after I got there, year and a half after I got there, was the strategy of finding stuff that was already made, pre-existing franchises that we could justify on a P&L basis. So that's when we went to wrestling, and then to Buffy, because Buffy, when you looked at it on a pure cash in, cash out basis, we would make money just from the advertising and the lift to the shows around Buffy on the schedule. So I could justify. It really wasn't like spending money. It was like buying a bond. So it was much easier to sell to.
Because it was an unknown. It was not an unknown quantity.
It was known, and it was already had. You knew what it was doing in the sales market, and you could cost it out, and you could make a deal. So you knew what it was going to be. And so
I guess you could do the same thing with wrestling, which I think came at that time from what, USA.
Wrestling, we did do the same thing with wrestling, and in fact, wrestling paid us. So that was so really for you at UPN. The challenge was really for me was just operating within the financial parameters and seeing what we could make go of it. It was clear that developing programming and putting that on was not a viable strategy, and basically we stopped doing that after a year there, which was frustrating because it's the only thing I really enjoyed.
That's what I was about to say. Is like, can't imagine that's what you thought you signed on for.
Yeah, it wasn't, but not even a little bit. In fact, I have to say, I actively disliked the experience, but I really felt that once I committed to doing it, that I had to see it through. I really felt an obligation to myself, really, more than to anybody else. And I wanted to keep, and it was sort of a test. It was so bad that it sort of became like an endurance marathon. It was like, can I really make this? Can I really make it through? And I just didn't want to quit, And the worse it got, the more I wanted to do it. And the less money there was to make programming, the more I wanted to figure out some other way of doing it. And and I stuck it out. I was pleased about that.
Now, you were there at the time when the whole Viacom Paramount deal, correct?
Yeah.
How did that affect everything?
Everything affected everything. It was just every major strategic move with the parties above us paralyzed the network that much further. And because obviously when these things are going on and they're in the press, that there's, CBS is going to get bought by Viacom, and then all of a sudden they don't need Chris Kraft is suing. Chris Kraft is now suing Paramount Viacom because it made the deal with CBS, and therefore it doesn't need the Chris Kraft station group anymore. And that obviously doesn't have a really good impact on a network that's owned 50% by one partner, 50% of the other partner when they're suing each other. So that paralyzed the network for 2 years, a year and a half. And it was always some, we were like, if you see Slumdog Millionaire, we were like the little 6-year-old street urchin, who has to, who falls into the crap and has to find a way to survive. And that's really what UPN was. It was an epic of, from my point of view, it was an epic of survival. Against daunting odds. And
a rather Sisyphean epic.
It was very, very difficult. But as I said, I think part of it was inevitable, given the structure of where the industry was, and part of it was brought on by, people's by the partners themselves.
So then, talk about, I guess, your decision to leave in 2001.
Well, I didn't make the decision to leave. CBS took over. Les was given responsibility for UPN. My contract guaranteed me full authority creatively, whatever the hell that meant when you didn't have any money, but it certainly formally, I didn't have to listen to anybody in terms of what shows I put on. And Les wasn't the kind of guy to work in that way anyway, if you know Les Moonves. So it was clear we just weren't meant to, there was no way we could actually work together. So it was just, even from the first time we met, it was like, how do we, let's have the lawyers talk. And there was neither of us ever thought for a second that we wanted to work together. So that was, and at the time it was, as I think is, a lot of people know, I'd sort of sued Paramount myself. So there was a lawsuit that was finally settled just around that time because they owed me an enormous amount of money on my contract, and they tried to worm out of it, and so that created a lot of friction as well, and Les finally coming in, we just kind of were able to end the whole thing, shake hands, and walk away, and that was 2001 or 2002, and that was it.
Was it at least settled to your satisfaction?
It was settled adequately. It was painful to have to sue people that you're close to. I'm not a litigious person. I'm actually not. I'd never been involved in any form of lawsuit. Nobody had ever sued me. I'd never been involved in anything. I'd never been named in anything. So for me, it was a very, very unsettling experience, and particularly since I had to sue people that I was personally close to. But on the other hand, as I've learned, in the entertainment business, people sacrifice just about anything for their self-interest, and I just felt that I had to protect mine and my family's.
So, coming through that minefield, walking out the other side, what does Dean Valentine decide he wants to do next?
Well, I feel like I'd ridden every technology into the ground. I was in a magazine editor as the magazine business was dying. I was in the network business as the network business was dying, and so I was off looking for something else to ride to its death. And I guess I found digital. But I really felt that the world of network television was ending. I mean, I thought about it a long time, and apart from any personal involvement in it, the network, the entertainment business, and particularly the network television business, was built on fundamentally monopolizing distribution. These are monopoly businesses that monopolize distribution. They monopolize the pathways to the consumer, and because that monopoly, they can charge an enormous amount of money from advertisers to reach those consumers. It was clear to me that we're entering a more democratic world from the standpoint of media, of many, many more choices, and technology that makes monopolization of distribution impossible. I mean, when owning a television station is a big deal. You got to put up a stick. It's got to be on a hill. There's all sorts of stuff that has to happen for that to exist. Internet, any idiot can log on and upload and be his own distributor. And what that means is that the core business model that's determined the entertainment business and the television business for the last century, the last 60 years, 70 years, is dead. It no longer is relevant, because if distribution is a commodity, and if anybody has access to distribution, it means that the billions and tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that were invested in owning distribution, television stations, cable, whatever you want to call it, over time really has to be written down, that the value of those things has to decline, because why would you own a television station? Why would I spend money, to put it in practical terms, why would I spend money on a cable bill if I can go to Hulu and get the shows directly? And that is indeed what's happening. So it means that the large entertainment companies, television as I knew it growing up, and as I loved it growing up, and as I was part of it as an executive, is going to die. It has to remake itself into something very, very different. And so it's not worth being part of anymore. There is nothing to be part of anymore. I think we're seeing it now. And this recession has accelerated larger trends that were happening anyway. But these companies will be spending the next 3, 4, 5 years basically cutting 70 to 80% of their overhead, which means that tens of thousands of people will lose their jobs before they find a business model that makes sense within the context of commodified distribution. So I knew I didn't want to be part of that, and I wanted to be part of the other side of it. And what that means is that finding a way to participate in the digital revolution. And I thought the best way to do that was to create a brand that might have long-term value on many, many different platforms, but that it could be launched on digital. That's why I bought comedy.com and launched that in February past year. And we launched it with like 5,000 people, and it's up to, we will close this month with probably around 2 million. So we're growing at a fairly rapid clip. the challenge will be how to work it out financially, because the financial aspect of the internet is still not there yet in a way that allows for the same sort of revenue as the traditional TV business. So that's the challenge before us now. It's a purely business.
Well, here's a question, because you talk about sort of this digital universe is much more democratic. Do you see it as a completely level playing field, or do you see it as a medium, I guess, in which you can gain an advantage, establish a brand, be a distributor of sorts, and monetize competitively with other people trying to jump into those same waters?
Well, I guess it's both to some extent. I mean, the internet it's still in flux. First of all, nobody knows what it is. The old model is dying, and the new one hasn't yet fully been born. And we're in that moment, and I don't know how long we're going to be in it. So it's not clear exactly how it's going to emerge. But it is clear that the landscape is flattening in terms of distribution, and that there's many points at which entertainment, content, storytelling can be launched into the distribution pipeline without having to go through a media gatekeeper in the way that you did before. The challenges are still huge, because there's still challenges in marketing. And how do I get somebody, in a world of infinite choice, how do I get somebody over here rather than over there? And what kind of marketing spend is legitimate in that world when there's so little revenue coming in, or the revenue is only a fraction of what it was in the traditional CPM model of network television. So the challenges are huge. The challenges of marketing, not challenges of distribution anymore. And as those things become clear, and maybe social networks play a part in that, maybe email plays. It's hard to know. We're sort of everybody involved in it is exploring all those avenues, but that's really the challenge of the internet, and it's a challenge that wasn't a challenge for traditional media, because there were only three choices. They didn't have to work so hard to get your eyeball.
There were three choices, and it was also really completely dependent on advertising revenue. And I think now in this universe, advertising revenue is, one source.
Right, and there are probably others, and it's probably more complicated and variable models of revenue, and much more shifting. And they're models that will probably have to change hundreds of times before they're stable, if they ever get stable, because the internet is so dynamic, and the processes are so dynamic. So it's a very challenging, it's really like riding, it's like riding a hurricane in a rowboat, but it's incredibly interesting, and it's intellectually challenging, and it's thrilling, I have to say, to have watched the birth and death of network television, just as a, just from the point of, to have really been part of something that has such massive global impact, still having impact, and to watch it end. I never, it's a very coherent story that's really happened in my lifetime and in my professional lifetime, and that's really been kind of incredibly interesting for me.
We're going to have to break tape, but can we get